Wicca got up and showed Brida to the door. "You didn't come here to find out about your soulmate," she said before saying goodbye. "You have a gift, and once I know what that gift is, I might be able to teach you the tradition of the moon." Brida felt very special. She needed to feel this, for the woman inspired a respect she had felt for very few other people. "I'll do my best. I want to learn the tradition of the moon," she thought, because the tradition of the moon doesn't require you to spend the night alone in a dark forest. "Now listen to me," said Wicca sternly. "Every day from today, at an hour of your choosing, sit down alone at a table and spread the tarot deck as I did, completely at random. Don't try to understand anything. Simply study the cards. They will teach you all you need to know for the moment." "It's like the tradition of the sun, me teaching myself again," thought Brida as she went down the stairs. And only when she was on the bus did she realize that the woman had spoken of a gift. But she could talk about that at their next meeting. For a whole week, Brida devoted half an hour a day to spreading the tarot cards on the table in the living room. She went to bed at 10 o'clock and set the alarm for 1 in the morning. She would get up, make a quick cup of coffee, and sit down to contemplate the cards, trying to decipher their hidden language. The first night she was very excited. Brida was convinced that Wicca had taught her some kind of secret ritual, and so she tried to spread the cards in exactly the same way, expecting some occult message to be revealed. After half an hour, apart from a few minor visions which she felt were merely the fruits of her imagination, nothing of any great note had happened. She did the same thing on the second night. Wicca had said that the cards would tell their own story, and, to judge by the courses Brida had attended, it was a very ancient story indeed, dating back more than 3,000 years to a time when mankind was closer to the original wisdom. The picture seemed so simple, she thought. A woman forcing open the mouth of a lion, a cart pulled by 2 mysterious animals, a man sitting before a table covered with sundry objects. She had been taught that the deck was a book in which the divine wisdom had noted down the main changes that take place during our journey through life. But its author, knowing that humanity learned more easily from vice than from virtue, had arranged for this sacred book to be transmitted across the generations in the form of a game. The deck was an invention of the gods. It can't be that simple, thought Brida every time she spread the cards on the table. She had been taught complicated methods, elaborate systems, and those cards arranged in no particular order began to have a troubling effect on her reasoning. On the third night, she threw the cards down angrily on the floor. For a moment she thought that this angry reaction might have some magical inspiration behind it, but the results were equally unsatisfactory, just a few indefinable intuitions which, again, she dismissed as mere imaginings. At the same time, the idea of her soulmate didn't leave her for a moment. At first she felt as if she were going back to her adolescence, to dreams of an enchanted prince crossing mountains and valleys in search of his lady of the glass slipper, or in order to awaken a sleeping beauty with a kiss. Finding your soulmate is something that only happens in fairy tales, she told herself, half joking. Fairy tales had been her first experience of the magical universe that she was now so eager to enter, and more than once she had wondered why people ended up distancing themselves from that world, knowing the immense joy that childhood had brought to their lives. Perhaps because they weren't content with feeling joy. She found the idea slightly absurd, but nevertheless recorded it in her diary as a creative thought. After spending a week obsessed with the idea of the soulmate, Brida became gripped by a terrifying feeling. What if she chose the wrong man? On the 8th night, when she woke again to carry out her vain contemplation of the tarot cards, she decided to invite her boyfriend out to supper the following night. She chose a fairly inexpensive restaurant because he always insisted on paying the bill, despite the fact that he earned far less as a research assistant to a physics professor at the university than she earned as a secretary. It was still summer, and they sat out at one of the tables on the pavement by the river. "I want to know when the spirits are going to let me sleep with you again," said Lawrence good-humoredly. Brida looked at him tenderly. She had asked him not to come to her apartment for 2 weeks, and he had agreed, protesting just warmly enough for her to know how much he loved her. In his way, he too was seeking to understand the mysteries of the universe, and if one day he were to ask her to stay away from him for 2 weeks, she would have to say yes. They dined unhurriedly and largely in silence, watching the boats crossing the river and the people walking past on the pavement. The bottle of white wine on the table was emptied and replaced by another. Half an hour later they had pushed their 2 chairs together and were sitting, arms around each other, gazing up at the starry summer sky. "Just look at that sky," said Lawrence, stroking her hair. "What we're looking at now is how the sky would have appeared thousands of years ago." He had told her the same thing on the day they first met, but Brida chose not to interrupt him. This was his way of sharing his world with her. "Many of those stars have already died, and yet their light still fills the universe. Other stars were born far away, and their light has not yet reached us." "So no one knows what the real sky looks like?" She had asked that same question on their first meeting, too, but it was good to repeat such delicious moments. "We don't know. We study what we can see, but what we see is not always what exists." "I want to ask you something. What are we made of? Where did the atoms that make up our bodies come from?" Lawrence looked up at the ancient sky and said, "They were created along with these stars and this river, in the first second of the universe's existence." "So, after that first moment of creation, nothing more was added?" "No, nothing. Everything moved and continues to move. Everything was transformed and continues to be transformed. But all the matter that exists in the universe now is the same matter from all those billions of years ago, and not so much as a single atom has been added." Brida sat studying the movement of both river and stars. It was easy to see the river flowing across the earth, but it was hard to see the stars moving in the sky, and yet both were moving. "Lawrence," she said at last, after a long silence during which they both watched a boat passing, "let me ask you what might seem an absurd question. Is it physically possible that the atoms that make up my body could have been in the body of someone who lived before me?" Lawrence stared at her in amazement. "What do you mean?" "What I said. Is such a thing possible?" "They could be in plants or insects, or they could have turned into helium molecules and be out there somewhere, millions of miles from Earth. But is it possible that the atoms that made up the body of someone who died could be in my body and in someone else's body?" He said nothing for a moment, then said, "Yes, it is." The sound of distant music reached them. It came from a barge crossing the river, and even from far away, Brida could make out the silhouette of a sailor framed in a lighted window. It was a tune that reminded her of her adolescence. It brought back memories of school dances, the smell of her bedroom, the color of the ribbon she would use to tie up her ponytail. Brida realized that Lawrence had never before considered the question she had asked him, and was, perhaps at that moment, wondering if his own body contained the atoms of Viking warriors, of volcanic explosions, or of prehistoric animals that had mysteriously disappeared. But her thoughts were elsewhere. All she wanted to know was this: had the man so tenderly embracing her once been part of herself? The barge came closer, and the music began to fill the air around them. Conversations at the other tables stopped too, everyone eager to find out where the sound was coming from, because everyone had once been an adolescent, attended school dances, and had dreams full of stories about warriors and fairies. "I love you, Lawrence." and Brida hoped against hope that this young man, who knew so much about the light from the stars, contained a little of the person she had once been. "It's no good. I can't do it." Brida sat up in bed and felt for the packet of cigarettes on the bedside table. Going against all her normal habits, she decided to smoke a cigarette before breakfast. It was another 2 days until she was due to meet Wicca again. She knew that during the last 2 weeks she had tried her hardest. She had channeled all her hopes into the method of spreading the cards taught to her by that attractive and mysterious woman, and she had struggled hard not to disappoint her, but the cards refused to reveal their secrets. Each time the previous 3 nights when she had finished the exercise, she had felt like crying. She felt vulnerable and alone, and had a sense that a great opportunity was slipping through her fingers. Once again, she felt that life was not treating her as it treated other people. It gave her every chance to achieve something, and just when she was close to that objective, the ground opened up and swallowed her. That's how it had been with her studies, with certain boyfriends, and with certain dreams she had never shared with anyone. She thought of the Magus. Perhaps he could help her. But she had promised herself that she would only go back to Folk when she knew enough about magic to face him again, and now it seemed that this would never happen. She lay for a long time in bed before deciding to get up and make breakfast. Finally, she screwed up the necessary resolve and courage to face another day, one more of her daily dark nights, as she had taken to calling them since her experience in the forest. She prepared some coffee, looked at her watch, and saw that she still had enough time. She went over to the shelf and searched among the books for the piece of paper the bookseller had given her. To console herself, she thought, there are other paths. She had met the Magus, she had met Wicca, and she would in the end meet the person who could teach her in a way that she could understand. But she knew this was merely an excuse. "I'm always starting things and then giving up," she thought rather sourly. Perhaps life would soon realize this and stop presenting her with the same opportunities over and over, or perhaps by always giving up when she had only just started, she had exhausted all possible paths without even taking a single step. But that was how she was, and she felt herself growing gradually weaker and less able to change. A few years before, she would have felt depressed by her own behavior, but she would at least still have been capable of the occasional heroic gesture. Now, though, she was starting to adapt to her own mistakes. She knew other people who did the same. They too got used to their mistakes, and it wasn't long before they began to see them as virtues, and by then it was too late. She considered not phoning Wicca and simply disappearing. But what about the bookshop? She wouldn't then have the courage to go there again. If she just disappeared, the bookseller would not be so kind next time. It's happened before. Because of some thoughtless gesture toward one person, I've ended up losing touch with other people I really cared about. She couldn't do the same thing now. She was on a path where valuable contacts were very hard to find. She steeled herself and dialed the number on the piece of paper. Wicca answered. "I won't be able to come tomorrow," said Brida. "No, the plumber can't make it either," replied Wicca. For a moment, Brida had no idea what the woman was talking about. Then Wicca started complaining about some problem with her kitchen sink, and how she'd arranged several times for a man to come and fix it, but he never came. She launched into a long story about old buildings, which might look terribly imposing, but which were, of course, beset by all kinds of problems. Then, in the middle of her story about the plumber, Wicca suddenly asked, "Have you got your tarot cards handy?" Surprised, Brida said that she did. Wicca asked her to spread the cards on the table because she was going to teach her a method of finding out whether the plumber would or would not turn up the following day. Feeling even more surprised, Brida did as she was asked. She spread the cards and sat staring blankly at the table while she awaited instructions from the other end of the line. The courage to explain the reason for her phone call was gradually fading. Wicca was still talking, and Brida decided to listen to her patiently. Perhaps she would become her friend. Perhaps then she would be more tolerant and show her easier ways of understanding the tradition of the moon. Wicca, meanwhile, was weaving one topic of conversation seamlessly into another, and having finished her litany of complaints about plumbers, she started describing an argument she'd had with the building manager about the caretaker's salary. She then moved on to a report that she'd read on old-age pensions. Brida accompanied all this with a few affirmative grunts, agreeing with everything Wicca was saying, but no longer listening. A terrible tedium took hold of her. This conversation with a woman she barely knew regarding plumbers, caretakers, and pensioners at that hour in the morning was one of the most boring things she'd ever experienced. She kept trying to distract herself with the cards on the table, finding little details that she'd never noticed before. Now and then, Wicca would ask if she was still listening, and she'd give a mumbled yes. But her mind was miles away, traveling, wandering about in places she'd never been to before. Every detail on the cards seemed to push her farther on in that journey. All of a sudden, like someone entering a dream, Brida realized that she could no longer hear what Wicca was saying. A voice that seemed to come from within, but which she knew came from outside, began to whisper something to her. "Do you understand?" Brida said that she did. "Do you understand?" asked the mysterious voice again. This, however, was of no importance. The tarot cards before her began to show fantastic scenes. Men with bronzed, oiled bodies wearing only thongs, and some sporting masks like the giant heads of fish. Clouds raced across the sky, as if everything were moving much faster than normal, and the scene shifted abruptly to a square, surrounded by grand buildings, where a few old men were urgently telling secrets to a group of young boys, as if some form of very ancient knowledge were about to be lost forever. "Add 7 and 8, and you'll have my number. I'm the devil, and I signed the book," said a boy in medieval clothes at what appeared to be a celebration. Drunken men and women smiled out at her. The scene changed yet again to the sea, to reveal temples carved out of the rocks, and then the sky began to be covered by black clouds pierced by brilliant flashes of lightning. A door appeared. It was a heavy door, like the door of an old castle. The door came closer to Brida, and she had a sense that soon she would be able to open it. "Come back," said the voice. "Come back," said the voice on the phone. It was Wicca. Brida was annoyed with her for interrupting such a remarkable experience, merely to bore her with more talk about caretakers and plumbers. "Just a moment," she replied. She was struggling to find that door, but everything had vanished. "I know what happened," Wicca told her. Brida was stunned, in a state of shock. She couldn't understand what was going on. "I know what happened," Wicca said again, in response to Brida's silence. "I won't say anything more about the plumber. He was here last week and fixed everything." Before hanging up, she said she would expect Brida at the agreed-upon time. Brida put down the phone without saying goodbye. She sat for a long time staring at the kitchen wall before subsiding into convulsive, soothing sobs. "It was a trick," Wicca told a frightened Brida when they sat down again in the Italian armchairs. "I know how you must be feeling," she went on. "Sometimes we set off down a path simply because we don't believe in it. It's easy enough. All we have to do then is prove that it isn't the right path for us. However, when things start to happen, and the path does reveal itself to us, we become afraid of carrying on." Wicca said that she didn't understand why so many people chose to spend their whole life destroying paths they didn't even want to follow, instead of following the one path that would lead them somewhere. "I can't believe it was a trick," protested Brida. She had lost her air of arrogance and defiance. Her respect for Wicca had grown considerably. No, the vision wasn't a trick. The trick I'm referring to is the phone. For millions of years, we only ever spoke to someone we could see. Then, in less than a century, seeing and speaking were suddenly separated. We think it's quite normal now and don't realize the huge impact it has on our reflexes. Our body still hasn't got used to it. The practical result is that when we speak on the phone, we often enter a state very similar to certain magical trances. Our mind tunes into another frequency and becomes more receptive to the invisible world. I know some witches who always keep a pen and paper by the phone, and while they're talking to someone, they sit doodling apparently nonsensical things. When they hang up, though, they find that their doodles are often symbols from the tradition of the moon. But why did the tarot reveal itself to me? That's the great problem with anyone wanting to study magic, replied Wicca. When we set out on the path, we always have a fairly clear idea of what we hope to find. Women are generally seeking their soulmate, and men are looking for power. Neither party is really interested in learning. They simply want to reach the thing they have set as their goal. But the path of magic, like the path of life, is and always will be the path of mystery. Learning something means coming into contact with a world of which you know nothing. In order to learn, you must be humble. Like plunging into the dark night, said Brida. Don't interrupt. There was a note of barely contained irritation in Wicca's voice, but Brida realized that it wasn't because of what she'd said. Maybe she's angry with the Magus, she thought. Perhaps she was once in love with him. They are more or less the same age. I'm sorry, she said. That's all right. Wicca seemed equally surprised by her own reaction. You were telling me about the tarot. When you were spreading the cards, you always had a preconceived idea of what would happen. You never let the cards tell their own story. You were trying to make them confirm what you imagined you knew. I realized this when we started talking on the phone. I realized, too, that it was a sign and that the phone was my ally. So I launched into a very boring conversation and asked you to look at the cards. You went into the trance provoked by the phone, and the cards led you into their magical world. Wicca suggested that the next time Brida was with someone who was talking on the phone, she should take a good look at their eyes. She would be surprised by what she saw. I want to ask something else, said Brida over tea in Wicca's surprisingly modern and practical kitchen. I want to know why you didn't let me abandon the path. Because, thought Wicca, I want to find out what the Magus saw in you, apart, I mean, from your gift. What she said was, because you have a gift. How do you know? Easy. By your ears. By my ears? How disappointing, Brida thought to herself. And there was me thinking she could see my aura. Everyone has a gift, but some are born with a more highly developed gift than others, me, for example, who have to struggle really hard to develop their gift. People who were born with a gift have very small, attached earlobes. Instinctively, Brida touched her earlobes. It was true. Do you have a car? No, Brida said. She didn't. Then prepare to spend a fortune on taxi fares, said Wicca, getting up. It's time to take our next step. Things are suddenly moving very fast, thought Brida, as she got to her feet. Life was beginning to resemble the clouds she had seen in her trance. By around mid-afternoon, they had reached some mountains about 15 miles south of Dublin. We could have made the same trip by bus, Brida grumbled to herself while she paid the taxi. Wicca had brought with her a bag and some clothes. If you like, I can wait, said the driver. It's going to be pretty difficult finding another taxi in these parts. This is the middle of nowhere. Don't worry, said Wicca, to Brida's relief. We always get what we want. The driver gave them a strange look and drove off. They were standing before a grove of trees that extended as far as the foot of the nearest mountain. Ask permission to enter, said Wicca. The spirits of the forests always appreciate good manners. Brida asked permission. The wood, which had up until then been just an ordinary wood, seemed suddenly to come to life. "Stay on the bridge between the visible and the invisible," said Wicca, while they walked among the trees. "Everything in the universe has life, and you must always try to stay in contact with that life. It understands your language, and the world will begin to take on a different meaning for you." Brida was surprised at Wicca's agility. Her feet seemed to levitate above the ground, making almost no noise. They reached a clearing near a huge stone. While she tried to think how that stone could have got there, Brida noticed the ashes from a fire right in the middle of the open space. It was a beautiful place. It would still be some hours before evening, and the sun shone with the warm gold of summer afternoons. Birds were singing, and a light breeze rustled in the leaves. They were quite high up, and she could look across and down at the horizon. Wicca took a kind of cloak out of her bag and put it on over her clothes. Then she placed the bag near the trees so that it couldn't be seen from the clearing. "Sit down," she said. Wicca was somehow different. Brida couldn't decide whether it was the cloak or the profound respect that the place inspired in her. "First of all, I must explain what I'm going to do. I'm going to find out how the gift manifests itself in you. I can only begin to teach you once I know something about your gift." Wicca asked Brida to try and relax, to surrender herself to the beauty of the place, just as she had when she had surrendered to the tarot cards. "At some point in one of your past lives, you set out along the road of magic. I know this from the tarot visions that you described." Brida closed her eyes, but Wicca asked her to open them again. "Magical places are always beautiful and deserve to be contemplated. Waterfalls, mountains, and forests are all places where the spirits of earth tend to play and laugh and speak to us. You are in a sacred place, and it is showing you the birds and the wind. Thank God for this, for the birds, the wind, and for the spirits who inhabit this wood. Always stay on the bridge between the visible and the invisible." Wicca's voice was making Brida feel more and more relaxed. She felt an almost religious respect for the moment. "The other day I spoke to you about one of the great secrets of magic, the soulmate. The whole of man's life on the face of earth can be summed up by that search for his soulmate. He may pretend to be running after wisdom, money, or power, but none of that matters. Whatever he achieves will be incomplete if he fails to find his soulmate. With the exception of a few creatures who are descended from the angels and who need solitude in order to encounter God, the rest of humanity will only achieve union with God if, at some point, at some moment in their life, they manage to commune with their soulmate." Brida noticed a strange energy in the air. For a few moments, and for some reason she could not explain, her eyes filled with tears. "In the night of time when we were separated, one of those parts was charged with nurturing and maintaining knowledge. Man. He went on to understand agriculture, nature, and the movements of the stars in the sky. Knowledge was always the power that kept the universe in its place and the stars turning in their orbits. That was the glory of man, to nurture and maintain knowledge. And that is why the whole human race has survived. To women was given something far more subtle and fragile, but without which knowledge makes no sense at all. And that thing was transformation. The men left the soil fertile. We sowed seeds, and the soil was transformed into trees and plants. The soil needs the seed, and the seed needs the soil. The one only has meaning with the other. It is the same thing with human beings. When male knowledge joins with female transformation, then the great magical union is created, and its name is wisdom. Wisdom means both to know and to transform. Brida noticed that the wind was growing stronger, and that Wicca's voice was leading her again into a trance. The spirits of the forest seemed alive and intent.